want to bring in Barbara Corcoran, joining us, one of the sharks on ABC's Shark Tank and a host of the podcast Business Unusual. Barbara, great to have you here this morning.
My pleasure to be here. It's not as doom and gloom as everybody's saying it is.
All right, so tell me why. What do you see right now?
Well, right now we have a constrained market. There are very few listings. Last week, for the first time in New York City, listings went up. And so there were more choices. But prior to that, not yet reflected in the numbers, is people just couldn't see homes. So people are looking at the statistics and believing it's over in New York. In effect, it hasn't even begun in New York because tenants have not been able to get in to see rental apartments, and more importantly, buyers have not been able to view apartments for sale. It's been a constrained market.
Okay, but what about these numbers I see from like Redfin and stuff where the new home sales are picking up? I mean, elsewhere people are apparently willing to buy without a walkthrough. How come not New York?
Well, remember, those areas that had no lock-throughs, those markets continue to go up. They never ceased. They just kept going. And most of them were lower-priced markets. When you looked at New York, if you divide the market between the super tall buildings that are luxury buildings, like 71 apartments now on the market, over $5 million in sales, nothing's moving. It's terrible out there. But when you look at the lower-priced apartments, the few that are available, they're selling like hotcakes. And they're selling sight unseen as well. And people are not willing to do that when they're buying a 2 or 3 bedroom family home or a luxury 5 bedroom third home in one of those towers. So you have different sectors. It's not out in the wash yet, is what I'm trying to say. You should give it another month and a half.
So right now on the higher end, is there price depreciation happening? Is there going to be this kind of regime shift? I mean, New York for a long time has been one of the frothiest markets. Is that potential to change here?
It's already changing. You know, the top end of the real estate market in New York City was weak to begin with. It's been weak for over a year and a half. There were too many jobs in construction, a number of other tall jobs planned that couldn't be stopped, so we had an excess of inventory. That's not new news, but what's happening now is the landlords, they have to show their underwear now, basically. They have to come out and say, okay, we're willing to deal. And are they dealing? Yes. Do they publicly deal? No. Do they quietly make concessions all the time? But the biggest problem is none of those buyers are even asking right now, and that's a problem. Those prices will come tumbling down. No doubt.
For the situation on the population side, there's been a lot of stories about this kind of exodus happening, mostly that we hear from young people or those that have been working in the service industry. What do you think about that as a real estate person, as a New Yorker? I mean, is that a big deal if that continues to happen?
Of course it's a big deal. When people leave a city, the city follows, does it not? I think the biggest indicator of how much of an exodus we already have from our urban areas, particularly New York City, is the renewals of rent leases. And most tenants are not choosing to renew. Most younger tenants in New York have chosen to go back and live with their parents and renegotiate themselves out of the lease. I know I own a lot of buildings here in New York that are for rent, and I mostly rent to younger people, and I have a 15% vacancy factor. I always had none. And the tenants that remain in my buildings are calling daily saying they can't meet the rent. What can we do? So is there a problem with exodus? You bet there is. But is it long-term? No. And I'll tell you why. Because I've lived through this New York City market, through hell and back so many times. And people always wrote it off, particularly on the heels of 9/11, was almost identical to this. People racing out of the city. And about 8-9 months back after the 9/11, we had exploding prices, explosion in rentals, and we'll see it again. Because the city isn't just about jobs, and that's the other thing. Everybody thinks, well, with the jobs not coming to New York, will everybody never return? Let me tell you something. The city always comes back. I just have such a blind faith in it because people come to the city for other reasons, for sophistication, for flagship stores, to show off if you're a corporate America, to show off how big and strong you are. The city is always attractive, but we have a short-term exodus of people now. no doubt.
This is where it gets, I think, the potential to kind of veer from the market discussion for a sec. But if you come with me to this, Barbara, there's a social aspect to it as well to some degree, is there not? I mean, New York, like we saw around the rest of the world too, there were explosive protests. But in New York, there's also this added layer of a big gap between rich and poor. You got the big Billionaire Avenue right near the park, buildings that cast shadows over Central Park, and then you got people in this Bloomberg story I'm reading splitting a $4,000 apartment between like 6 people. I used to put up the fake walls that don't go all the way to the top. Yeah. I mean, if that doesn't get solved.
Yeah. So your question was what?
What happens if that doesn't get solved? Is there a potential where people leave and they don't come back? If they go to a place like a Chicago where you can get a little bit more square footage?
Of course. You know, what the nature of New York City is it's mobile. What its very lifeblood is that we have people come in, people go out. We have countries come in, countries go out. All right, we've seen that over the years. Will people still come back to the city is the question. Will they leave? Of course. But they always come back. There's always someone who wants New York City. That I learned. I remember sweating it out, building a real estate business and having the entire Chinese population that represented 80% of my sales in the condominiums leave because they had a terrible economy. And I watched the Japanese come in and snap up their apartments. I watched them leave. I saw the Germans come in. And I saw the multi-billionaires come in. Somebody always comes in and takes up what somebody else doesn't want. It's the nature of this city. I have a blind faith in that.
Who do you see right now, or in terms of potential new buyers? Where does the strength from the economy outside the U.S. come in? Is there a foreign buyer in particular right now that is looking at some of the depressed prices, saying, "Hey, this is a time I wanted to get this, lofty, expensive apartment. Now I can"?
Absolutely not. You have an absence of foreign buyers, and you've had no foreign buyers in New York City on those super luxury apartments for almost a year now. And right now with the pandemic, they are not going to be quick to come back because they have so many other options. You know, people don't buy their 5th luxury home for $7-12 million when they have their beachfront property that has acres of land, when they have their ski chalet in Aspen they can move to. They have so many other options that the rich are the slowest to come back. And that's why I predict that the higher the end of the market in New York City, the worse it's going to get hit. But the starter apartment that always brings in the new blood, the new recruits that have to be trained, whatever, will always come back, and that's where the market begins to take shape every time.
I know that your focus, for the most part, is on the residential side. We've heard a lot about commercial real estate and what's going to change if business functionality changes. Are there going to be commercial buildings that change into real estate? Is there a potential here for that to happen?
I have a totally different attitude about commercial. I think we're going to be seeing a bloodbath, the likes of which we've never seen. And let me tell you why. All of our workers have gone home, and they have decided they don't really want to come back. They don't want to be in the subway. They don't want to be in crowded elevators. They don't want to be in the commute. And this just not only pertains to New York City, but it pertains to every urban area. And the boss at work has sat there and decided, why am I paying all this rent for these giant floor plates when people don't really have to work here? The latest thing is having some people come back, rotations of teams. So a particular marketing team comes back for a week and collaborates and then moves out. And then in those same desks, they're clean, the next team comes in. And what is happening right now, whether people want to admit it or not, is landlords are getting calls every day. And a lot of people think that the commercial leases have 5-year, 2-year, 10-year runs, and we're not going to have problems. Let me tell you, everyone's renegotiating their lease right now and trying to get out of that lease. The tenant is in charge of the market right now, not the landlord. And for any smart landlord out there who isn't doing everything they can to retain their tenants, they're out of their mind, because those tenants are never going to be back. I have a whole different attitude toward commercial than I do through residential.
Barbara, before we let you go to that point, to come back to the residential side and who's got the power right now, tenants versus the landlords, you mentioned the vacancy rates that you see in your own buildings. What's the situation in terms of how long there can be this tension between folks who can't pay? Do the landlords need help from the government to say, look, we need your money to prevent us from going after the tenants right now?
That would be a lovely idea. I welcome it, but no one feels sorry for the landlord. People envision the landlord as somebody really fat and rich, and nobody really cares what happens to them. Who's going to pay the price with the landlords if their rent rolls say go down another 10%, plus they lose another 10% of their tenants as they can't meet their mortgages? Every building in New York is financed, so what will happen is all the banks will have to renegotiate. It would be lovely if the government provided some help for the landlords, but I just don't see that happening. I really don't. I wish it would. But I do believe that the banks are going to pay the price for the landlords, commercial and residential and retail. The banks in the end are going to have to deal with the owners and compensate in some way, and that is going to affect the whole economy. I'm a little concerned about that, needless to say.
Okay, Barbara, thanks for being here with us. Appreciate you joining.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Barbara Corcoran is, of course, one of the hosts on Shark Tank and a host of the podcast Business Unusual.